Hello, this is Joe Sinnona, and we're back with Sinnona Speaks Seminars, Coffee Talk, special segments with my good friend and attorney, Anthony Nozzolillo, who is going to discuss an as-is sales. Hello, Anthony. Welcome to Coffee Talk. How are you doing?
Joe, my friend, how are you? Happy Wednesday.
I'm good. I'm just gearing up for 2023, and I had some thoughts. And I said, why don't we discuss what an as-is sale is? Because a lot of agents are thoroughly confused. They really, some of us don't know truly what an as-is sale means in real estate. And I said, you know what? That's a good topic. Why don't we discuss as-is sales? Because, my definition is clearly a little bit different than the consumers. The consumers who are sellers don't understand, as is. And then when I get it to the hands of an attorney preparing a contract, and I say it's an as-is sale, I tend to find a conflict between that attorney and the buyer representative attorney that's selling me. You don't know the difference between an as-is sale. So I've been in the business so many years, and I've heard so many different interpretations, and we're going to clear up the mess today.
Let's start cleaning up. Well, as you said, that preposition as is it is confusing, and there is corrosion of conformity down the talk line, where it starts with one person and it gets to the contract stage. And again, as you said, different interpretations as to the meaning of the term. The way I like to break it down to its constituent core, but yet keep it simple enough for people to understand, whenever the term as is used with respect to real property, or obviously the sale of a home, I always use the following two terms. As is deals specifically with the structural and aesthetical aspects of the home. And then I take it to the next step, saying you're buying a home that's been lived in, and one standard deviation from it being lived in would be normal wear and tear, with a little caveat, more than normal wear and tear. And to elaborate and explain, the examples I would use would be if there's broken bricks outside, holes in the walls, if there's upheaval of the floors, if there's broken windows, things of that nature. So again, normal wear and tear living in with one standard deviation above. And I like to use the reasonable person standard, being what would a reasonable person interpret that definition to be? Purchasing a home that was lived in with normal wear and tear and one standard deviation above. So I try to create that picture with respect to what as is means.
Okay. So cosmetics, anything cosmetically challenged in a home,
correct.
If the buyer sees it as is and buys it as is, that's as is.
Correct. Structural or aesthetical.
Am I going ahead if I ask you the seller representation clause in the contract that clearly states as is?
But actually, I'm glad that you did that. So you know what? To that point, that's what it pertains to, structural and aesthetical. What it doesn't pertain to, and I'll give you what it doesn't apply to, and then I'll incorporate by reference the contract provisions that you just referenced to show you how to differentiate. As is does not pertain to, unless it's otherwise specified in a rider to the contrary. Again, it does not apply to the plumbing, heating, ventilation, mechanical, sprinkler, any systems, okay? And it also doesn't apply to any hazard or safety issues, such as mold, asbestos, if there's rats, if there's a nest in the attic or something like that, unless specifically agreed to or allotted for in a rider or provision to the contract that specifically states that the purchaser is buying subject to. And the last thing, as is, does not apply to unless specified to the contrary, again, in a separate portion of the contract, i.e. a separate rider, to any title issues or marketability or insurability issues or open permits or violations. So if you want to draw a line.
Okay, so that's the distortion right there. I want to interrupt you because that's where people get really messed up in their head. Realtors, sellers, buyers alike, because if I'm buying this product as
Mhm.
is. I'm talking
Correct.
about everything about the product, everything about inside, outside the house. So then there's a clause, a provision, as you know, in it that says representation clause. And it says seller will represent that the heating, the plumbing, the roofing, the electric, the overall structure, everything that this buyer saw from day one is in good working order till the closing.
Well, well,
How is
that's
that as is?
the thing is you're mixing up. There are actually two different provisions in the contract. One is the as is provision, but incorporated specifically in that provision says, with the exception of paragraph 16F, which contradicts and supersedes, saying, nevertheless, the plumbing, heating, ventilation, all the systems
Now,
will be
is
operational.
16F the seller's representation clause?
It's 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 part of it, yes.
Part of it.
In other words, the as is,
Okay.
there's two clauses. One is the as is clause, and then 16F is the representation clause, where again it contradicts, well, not contradicts per se, it just takes it to the next level. So it's a two-tier analysis.
Got
It's
it.
being sold as is, but for the plumbing, heating, ventilation systems, which have to be operational. Now, the good thing about New York State and contract law, unless it involves criminality, you can contract into anything you want. So you can have a rider to the contract saying, nevertheless, purchaser is aware that the plumbing isn't functional and they're purchasing subject to the non-operation plumbing. But if the contract is silent and doesn't contain a clause to that effect, the presumption, irrebuttable presumption, is the plumbing, heating, ventilation systems will be operational. Any and all open permits will be closed out and violations as well. Any and all hazard and safety issues, like I said, asbestos, mold, will be remediated and are part of the seller's
So the
responsibility to
sellers
disseminate.
still have to do their part in order to
Co-
deliver
Correct,
the
unless
house in
unless
good working order, right?
yeah, unless it's specified to the contrary. So my point being, when you hear the term as is, on its face, it only applies again to structural and aesthetical aspects of the home. If you want it doesn't encompass the systems, it doesn't encompass hazard and safety, and it doesn't encompass any title issues. Again, unless represented otherwise in the contract.
Does it
So
specifically state about the title issues?
no, it does. It does. There are provisions of the title, but that as is provision does not connect with that. That's the thing. People, there's no connection between the as is and the title aspect. The title aspect has its own separate provisions, whereby it'll say there's the home is being sold with a certificate of occupancy for a one family home, but that doesn't mean, if there's nothing to the contrary, if you get the CO search and compare it to the survey, that now it's a one family home with an in-ground pool. The seller can't take the position and absolve themselves by saying, but the contract says as is. You see what I'm saying? That provision as is will not serve as a defense to the seller having to perform with respect to bringing the home up to code from a
Okay,
C of O standpoint.
so walk me through this, because a lot of realtors, when they are going on listing presentations and they hear that word as is
Right?
from a seller, the
Correct.
seller's interpretation is different from the realtor's interpretation, that's
Which
different
is
from the
different from
attorney.
the right. So
So let's hear from the legal standpoint, which I don't want to practice legalities here. I don't want to
sure.
practice law at all, because that's, first of all, a violation of my code of ethics. But when we go on
Right.
listing presentations, we need to define for the seller what truly is as is. And
Correct.
I wish lawyers would give like a little form that we could stick in our forms to clearly
Well, what I'll
define
do
the
is
as is provision.
I will actually generate one for you and I'll email it to you. So I'll
Oh,
break
that's
it down
great. That's
so you
wonderful.
can see, as is, again, structural and aesthetical. In the event you want to incorporate, because a lot of times, if there's an inspection report, which I encourage people to get, if there's asbestos or if there's mold, um, if the seller can't say I'm selling it as is, because the attorney representing the buyer will presumably look at that and raise that as an issue, saying there's mold and asbestos. Now, if the seller's understanding was that the home had asbestos and mold and was being sold subject to, that would need to be reflected in the contract. But then the question becomes, did the house get priced accordingly? Now that the buyer is aware that there's asbestos and mold, because the mindset of the buyer is, I'm buying it as is based on what I see. The
Well,
latent
you know
aspects.
how foreclosures and REOs and all
Right.
those other properties, short sales, right? Those are
Right. But that's
truly as is too, but
right.
you're
That's a
not
horse of a
buying
different
that
color.
type of home today. We'll put that
Right. But the thing is,
aside for a little conversation in a little
yeah,
bit.
because those
But
contracts, well, all those provisions are stricken in those contracts. So again, the contract itself for those type of transactions are much different. They look the
the
same, but
different
again,
trends. Okay.
the caveat, yeah, as far as the representations that the seller makes. And here's another way to look at it also. If the home is really being sold as is, right, then every transaction that has that as is, the Article 14 property disclosure would not be given, right? Because
Right.
what does the Article 14 disclosure do? If it's given by the seller in a 1-to-4 residential dwelling purchase to a buyer, that absolves the seller post-closing for any issues. Now, if it's being sold as is, the seller can say, I'm not giving you this credit because I'm not making representations and I'm not filling out the disclosure because I'm selling it as is. So to that point, if the term as is really was that all encompassing, the Article 14 disclosure would not be applicable, but that's not the case. It is.
I'm glad you touched upon that, because the property disclosure statement, which gives the buyer a history of what the seller did, is not being fully filled out by the seller, because it
Hardly
seems
ever.
to give the buyer, the $500 credit at the closing
Absolutely.
and just exonerate themselves
It's
from.
a no-brainer. Joe, to that point, even though that only came into effect in 2020, prior to that, it used to be caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. The
Right.
house could fall apart the next day and you have no recourse. Even though it's 22 years old, it's still in its infancy stage on the case law books, because no seller fills it out for $500 by giving the credit. It's very difficult to prove
I'm
in a
glad
court
I
of
got
law
an attorney here today to really
that
clarify things, but I'm going to
yeah,
challenge this, because in the state of New Jersey, where that same disclosure form is being practiced, there's none of this $500. It says clearly in the state of New Jersey in their form that this is just for historical purposes. This is to give the buyer an insight on what the seller, did. I don't know what just crashed over here, but I'll get to that later. But
you mentioned New Jersey and New York. That's what happened.
right, I think so. I think the earth shook a little bit. But you know what I'm saying? Like, New Jersey has their law, New York has their law. What happened in this whole thing? Because clearly the New Jersey one says as is at the bottom.
Right.
That the seller is giving this information and doesn't want to be incriminated for any of this information, or held accountable, let's say, for a better word. And in New York, the $500 is just given, and the buyer cannot, have any recourse.
Great question. After. You know why? New York frowns on litigation. The courts want to purge their calendar. The last thing they want is all this additional litigation post-closing. Plus, it becomes a he said, she said. Did the seller actually know and purposely conceal this condition that they knew about? How can you prove that? Especially if it's after closing. The roof leaks. Okay, but you've been in the house for 2 weeks. How do I know that the seller didn't engage in an activity that caused the roof to leak? To prove that it was the buyer, it's very difficult as far as a burden of proof. Then you end up in litigation back and forth. So they figure with the $500 credit. Now, again, it's not all absolving. It should be known. Again, if there's fraud that's engaged, or if there's purposeful concealment, and it can be demonstrated that the seller either knew or should have known as to this condition and tried to get away with it by just giving the $500 credit, the buyer could potentially have recourse if they can prove. Again, if the burden of proof is there and it's so obvious that any person would realize, look, the seller actually had to have known. But those instances are few and far between.
Well, the sellers today, when I go into a listing presentation, and I'm going to go backwards a little bit to, you mentioned about title issues. And, I don't know if the issue lies with C of O change or certificate of occupancy change, for the people that don't know what a C of O is. But the certificate of occupancy change is the finished basements, the finished attics into rooms now that become livable spaces. And sometimes in the basement, they put like a not, I don't want to say an extra kitchen, but a wet bar or a full bathroom with a shower, right? And then what they do is the owner gets nervous because when I ask them on listing presentations, how many bedrooms and bathrooms you have? And they start to get nervous, and the wife looks at the husband looks at the wife, or the significant others, right?
Right.
At each other, and they look at me and they go, well, we didn't buy it this way, but we wanted a man cave, or we wanted a finished basement. Now, does that come into play with the word as is?
No, it absolutely does not. Because again, there's a separate provision that deals specifically with the title aspects. Part of the title aspects would be the C of O. And as far as alterations, improvements, additions, any of those structures have to have, a CO or indicate that a permit was obtained and that they conform with building code. Now, again, the presumption is that as is does not apply to that, and it doesn't. But you can stipulate otherwise in a separate rider saying the purchaser acknowledges and the seller is not making any legal representation as to the wet bar in the basement. The seller is under no obligation to procure any permits, to expend any monies or effort so as to demonstrate that this particular structural item conforms with code. So my point being,
so then that isn't as is. You take it the way it is.
No, but again, it's not implied. If it's silent, the presumption is that they have to get the permit for it.
Well, what if the seller puts that provision in that he's not going to be, or she's not going to be responsible?
Then that puts it into the as is. That's why the only thing as is, as I said, covers right off the bat is structural and aesthetical issues.
So the only one who can really decide is the buyer at that point. If they decide to take the finished basement, if they decide to take the finished attic, right? It's up to the buyer then. So every buyer's agent out there has to school their client to say, look, whatever is down here, I already informed myself with the seller's agent, the listing agent, that this is all being sold the way it is with no representation.
Correct. And when you put that on your deal sheet, the attorney will then, or should, at that point, have a separate rider drafted indicating, like I just said, that the seller makes no representation as to the legality of the bathroom in the basement, or whatever the item is, because that avoids any potential for confusion or room for interpretation when you get further down the line, because it's right there in writing. Because if it's not there, then you're going to have this, well, we said as is. And then if you break it down to its constituents, it's going to say, yeah, but as is in this provision. This provision of the contract deals with COs and doesn't say that you're not responsible for procuring the CO. So the bottom line is full transparency, full disclosure, and a separate rider indicating, what items are specifically being purchased exactly the way they are. I'm not using the term as is because, again, that's more of a structural and aesthetical. So in order to avoid any issues, you really want to be transparent as the seller, as much as you can be, as to what's not there. Because if you catch everything or address it in the infancy stage, it makes the process more streamlined. Because when the purchaser's attorney gets a copy of the title report, which has the C of O in it, and then eventually a survey print, which is the schematical layout of the home and any additions thereto, and compares the CO to the survey, but the CO was issued for a one-family dwelling with an attached garage. But now the survey shows a one-family dwelling with an attached garage, an in-ground pool, a two-story extension. So now that's where it's going to come in, where if the seller tries to say, well, we're selling it as is, I'm suggesting to you that argument is not going to hold water. Because
I've been doing this so long that I can safely say that sellers create their own issues. And then they expect us, you and me, to clean up the messes. And if you had a seller in front of you today, and you could talk to that seller and make like a little bit of a checklist to avoid any of these issues. But what if the seller's already made these mistakes, finished the basement, changed the conformity of the C of O, or perhaps there's a refrigerator that he or she knows that is not working properly, or a stove. What would you say to a seller today who's anticipating selling their home in 2023?
I would say, number one, price it accordingly. This way, the buyer knows they're buying subject to, but they're getting it for this price. Or the seller can say, I want what I want, because there's always a buyer out there. You know, a house is worth whatever someone's willing to pay for it. There will be someone who will buy it subject to, but timing becomes a factor. You know what I mean? You don't have that kind of time. You need the money, or the rates can fluctuate if there's a lending component involved. So the answer is, I always say be as transparent as possible, because if you're transparent right from the get-go, everything is fully disclosed. Again, there's no question marks. Everything has period. And the contract you can just defer to. It's in black and white. That's why it exists. That is why the statute of fraud exists. In New York State, anything that pertains to the sale of real property has to be reflected in a written format. So everything is delineated. So no one can say, well, you said this and I didn't know that. It's all in black and white.
What about like fences, sheds, any type of exterior structures?
That's a great question. There's another provision of the contract that deals specifically with that. As far as variations between record lines, that's where the fences come in. So let's say the schematical layout of the house is a square, but then you notice that there's an encroachment on the square of a fence from the next door neighbor. Again, as is would not cover that particular category, because again, there's a separate paragraph in the contract that pertains to that. That's why I'm saying the mindset should be, it doesn't apply. The term as is, the takeaway should be to plumbing, heating, ventilation systems, hazard, safety issues, or any title issues. If you want to address those so that the buyer is aware they're purchasing subject to, you need to delineate it specifically in a separate rider so that it's crystal clear. And to that point,
so where does that fall on? The selling agent, the listing agent, or the selling agent to find out all of these little nuances with the house? Because
it really should be
what if it's not disclosed to the listing agent? Like if it's
that's a great point. That's a great point. If it's not disclosed to the listing agent, then it could potentially become a problem going forward, because now the contract is silent to that issue. And in New York State also, the contract is always construed against the drafter, meaning the seller's attorney who drafts it. So they have the obligation to fully disclose. If it's not, or if it's silent, the buyer will benefit from that. See what I'm saying? Because they're going to say, well, you drafted the contract. You had the duty and the obligation to disclose. You had to know or should have known. So really, a seller should be transparent. At the end of the day, if they're trying to weasel their way out and crossing their fingers that hopefully it doesn't come out, that's really not the way to proceed, because you could potentially incur situations going forward. If you're transparent right from the get-go, that's the best way. It may take a little longer to get into contract, but at least you know once you're in contract, irrespective of what that title report shows, or what the CO shows, of what the survey shows, you're good to go because you've covered every avenue. Now, what I do want to touch on also, as far as the as is, again, a buyer can agree to buy a home with plumbing that doesn't work, with heating that doesn't work, with asbestos. Again, they can contract into anything they want. But if there's a lending component, meaning that there's a mortgage involved, you need to make sure that the provision says that the buyer acknowledges they're purchasing subject to, the seller's not responsible to cure anything. But in the event the lender refuses to fund the loan as a result of the non-functioning system or the asbestos, that the buyer can then cancel the contract. If you don't have that second part,
how would the lender know? Through appraisal?
Appraisal, right? I mean, you don't know how in depth the appraisal is going to be. I mean, the appraiser reserves the right to come into the house. If they see that there's no heat because it's freezing, that could potentially compromise the loan.
Now, I've seen these problems in all full disclosure. I've seen these problems occur mostly with any kind of loan, because a lot of people equate these problems to an FHA loan or a VA loan. And then I find there's a great amount of discrimination against those buyers who have those loans. It's everything across the board, right? Conventional loans.
Exactly. Well. I tell everyone it depends on the bank and the appraiser for the bank. There's no, this bank, the appraiser only looks at this or this.
Right. No, but you see that misnomer that's out there in
that's
our
why
community,
full disclosure all the time, as long as you're transparent. Now, again, could it hinder getting to contract quicker? Yes, because you're going to go back and forth with terms. But again, would you rather sacrifice short-term loss for long-term gain, right? It may take a little more time to get the contract, but once the fully executed contract is in place, that again, the potential for something to materialize or come up is very, very slim, if non-existent at all.
I want to go back now. I'm going to go back to a subject that could be a little sore subject. You don't have to answer the question, but title companies,
Story of my life, Joe.
Well, I being in the business that long, have seen actual mistakes of title companies that have been given those, they issue title insurance,
Okay.
and the seller has no recourse as to title issues that came about during the course of, let's say, of this sale, and sellers have no recourse to go back to the title company that gave them the title insurance to begin with, to clear up some of the issues that go forward. Can you talk about that?
Yes, let me just elaborate. We need to be clear. A title company, okay, does not insure against municipal searches. Municipal searches being certificate of occupancies, housing and building searches, or surveys. The only thing a title company does is ensure that title is marketable and insurable, meaning there's no defects as far as the transferability of title from one person to the next, meaning there's no springing heirs that could come out of the woodwork saying, hey, this is my house. There's no liens or mortgages against the home, that would create a lien that is first in line to the new buyer. So as far as title insurance, they don't address, they have nothing to do with the C of O's, nothing to do with open permits. Those are for informational purposes only. That's another thing where the as is comes into play, because people don't realize. They'll say, well, I bought the house with the open permit, I'm selling it as is. So again, it's a two-tier analysis. The as is doesn't apply to title. And now the second step would be the title insurance itself doesn't have anything to do with the open permit in and of itself. So that's why you really need to be, as I say, full disclosure. If you're the listing agent, sit down with the seller and say, look, is there anything we should know about? Any open permits, any debts? I do that when I represent a seller, even though I get the deal sheet, because a lot of times, well, I would say a lot, I'd say about 50% of the time, there'll be something the seller, my client, discloses to me that they didn't disclose to the listing agent, that there is an illegal bathroom or there is an extension that was done. So then I'll have to call the listing agent. I don't like that phone call, because I'm like, look, we got a little bit of a hiccup. I was just advised that there's an extension that was done, and there's no permit for it. So we need to address that now. You see what I mean?
You have a fan in one of our agents who just tuned in, Ravenshine. She's listening to you and she's saying, this is great. This is great. It is great news, Raven, because, and like everybody else out there, every realtor needs to understand that first of all, they're not lawyers, they're not lawyers in the field. This is why we went to real estate school and Anthony went to law school. And that's why title companies go to title school.
But you're just as important, if not more so, paramount in the transaction.
Yeah, but we have our limitations, right? That we have our limitations, and sellers put us in a position to, they say, protect me, help me. You know what? This is where I hand off the ball to you.
Correct.
And you clean up this mess, or try to clean up this mess, and we work hand in hand. Like I had a sale in 2022 with Christian Velez on my team, and there was so many open permits.
He's great.
This was a deal a little bit from hell, in New Hyde Park, where a contracting company opened up a permit. They opened up several permits, and they didn't close those permits. And the owners kept insisting on an as-is sale because their uncle left them the house, and they didn't know what was open, what was closed, and they just simply painted the brush and said, we don't want to handle anything, right? So I happen to know the contracting company that left these open permits like 10 years ago. And I had a connection there, and I said, could you, go go back and close the permits. And the gentleman did. He was very straightforward about it. He knew exactly, he pulled out the file. He saw they were open. He went, he closed all the permits. And then what happened? The county didn't want to close them on their end, which made the title company still shouting from rooftops that the permits were still open.
Right. Well, they have no choice. They have to reflect what's on public record.
Right.
Sorry, I'm chief counsel to a title company, so I'm
but they did three.
I'm always gonna err on there.
But they did 3 title inspections. They did 3 title inspections stating that it was still open permit, even though the contracting company already closed it. So again, the expectations going forward with every seller is, make sure you don't have open permits. What about pre-title inspections? You think that's a good idea?
I actually, you know what? I do like that a lot. Listen, if you're not sure, have a C of O search run, have an H&B search run. Most realtors have contacts or connections with title companies.
What's an H&B? What's an H&B?
I'm sorry?
What's an H&B?
Housing and building search.
Okay.
H&B, housing and building search. This way, you have it. It's on paper. If there's no open permit or there's no violation of record, then you know that you're getting it clean. But with one caveat, it could be that there is something that was done absent a permit. It just was never reflected in the record. So again, but it adds a little more insulation and solace having the search than not having it, because if there is an open permit of record, it'll be disclosed on the search. And but for having the search, you wouldn't have known. And they're not that expensive. And again, most realtors know title companies. So, a lot of times I work for On Point, which is a title company. The realtors will call and say, can you do me a favor and run a C of O search for this property or an H&B search for this property? And we do that. This way, it's there, it's open, everyone knows.
So you hear that, sellers? You come and you contact me. I have the hook with Anthony Nozzolillo, and he's going to give me a free title inspection for you. I know I'm going to pay for it with a cup of coffee from Coffee Talk, but I definitely would do that. If I was a seller today, I would do a title inspection on my property just to make sure that any of these pitfalls, we can avoid down the line. This is awesome news. And this
to that point too, Joe, also a survey because a lot of people don't know that their fence line is cut short. They believe that they have this boundary, but in essence, they erected a fence without a survey. So to that point,
I saw a survey from 1940 something the other day, and the seller goes, "I have my survey. Why are they ordering a new survey?" And
because
and they don't realize how old that survey is.
Right. I always recommend a new survey, no matter what. I always do. It's a couple of $100.
Like, let's say I got a survey in 2021. Do I still need a new one?
I always say get a brand new survey, because you never know what could have happened yesterday. That's the way I look at it. Okay. And again, to be penny rich and pound foolish, you're not buying a stick of gum. This could be the biggest investment of your life. So you really want to have as much due diligence as possible. And again, people say, well, a survey inspection, meaning a surveyor goes with the existing survey print that's been provided to them and just inspects what's there and reflects any updates. But I'm not a big fan of that, because I don't like the fact that someone else is deferring to the work product of another surveyor and is simply updating what's there. Nothing beats an original survey where it's a fresh piece of paper, a clean slate. The survey goes there and depicts exactly what's there. You can't beat that. It costs a little more, but again, definitely worth it in the end.
So this as is conversation has a lot of definitions in summary, a lot of interpretations, and a lot of, addendums, if you will, to a contract. And you've enlightened me, because at least I know that when a seller tells me something is as is, or they don't want to be bothered with the headaches, I'm going to just defer them to an attorney.
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, the buck doesn't stop there with as is. Then it becomes, well, what do you mean? Is there asbestos? Is there mold? Are there open permits? It's a myriad of items that don't fall under that as is protection.
And I like your form. your form with the definition so that I could show it to my seller on my listing presentations. That's a great added value for the new year for 2023 or to all realtors.
Make sure you get a copy.
And listen, how can all of us realtors reach you?
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm chief counsel to On Point Land Services Corporation. It's a title company in Merrick, New York. My email is anthony@onpointland.com, all one word, ONPOINTLANDCO.com. And my office number is 516-600-9750. And our website is www.onpointland.com.
Awesome. We will revisit more issues with Anthony in the new year. This is great stuff because it's not only going to educate the sellers on what to do going forward in listing their homes, but it's also going to educate the listing agents in our community of realtors throughout Long Island, throughout Queens, throughout Brooklyn. And I look forward to another show with you, Anthony.
Joe, thank you so much for having me. I do look forward to coming back. Hope you're enjoying the holiday season. And again, thanks for having me on, my friend.
Thank you so much. And this is Joe Sinnona from Sinnona Speaks Seminars with another special segments edition. And we've had Anthony Nozzolillo here from On Point Title Services, and a great attorney with a great insight, great knowledge on the word as is today, which has been our subject. Thank you, Anthony. Have a great day.
Thank you. Be well. Take care.
Bye-bye.